Hello, everybody. Welcome back. It is another week of the 2025 Formula One season and another week for our race review slash preview. We are talking Austin, Texas, the United States Grand Prix this time out. A big, important weekend for the championship, I would say. And let's go ahead as we navigate the chaos that is always turn one. And a little bit of a touch to the back end of Jack doing there. Let's talk just a little bit about, start at the top and work our way down. Max Verstappen in a championship chase maximized what he needed to do here. Maximum points on the weekend, a pole and victory in the sprint, a pole and victory in the Grand Prix. You can't ask much more of him there as far as scoring the points. And he did get a little bit of help in the sprint, which we will talk about a little bit later. But this is the kind of weekend that makes his championship challenge much, much stronger. And as far as the car goes, even Yuki had a modest weekend. Granted, I know the bar for success for Yuki is kind of in the floor at the moment, but he did, in fact, score points in both the sprint and the Grand Prix. So Yuki Tsunoda making a couple things happen over the course of the weekend. That Red Bull car, it continues to round into form. And Max Verstappen continues to trim the deficit as I do not pay attention to the dirty air and wash away out wide. I've been spending all kinds of time preparing for an iRacing event of 24 hours at Le Mans. So the feel for driving an F1 car is completely gone. The way I have to drive a GT3 is completely different to the way I brake and drive this F1 car, which is always so much fun. But Red Bull, not a ton to talk about because, well, they just kind of went about their business. McLaren, on the other hand, there is quite a bit to talk about for them. And it was another bad weekend for the championship leader, Oscar Piastri. Obviously, you have the very important moment that was the sprint, where turn one got a great start compared to Lando, tried to make a move, tried to go for the cutback, and got collected as both McLarens ended up on the tow trucks, neither of them scoring points in the sprint. Obviously, Lando's kind of off the pace start had a bit of a factor to play in that. Why are you swinging out wide like that? Allowing Oscar to pull alongside. But Oscar, and here's where I'll be controversial a little bit. I don't think the cutback was a bad idea from Oscar, because especially if you watch the replay, he left enough space on the apex for the car of Nico Hülkenberg to be there on the inside. What he didn't account for, and I think is impossible for him to account for, is Fernando Alonso diving up late and making it two cars on his inside. So the cutback is always a bit of a risky move into turn one. Agreed. But I think he made the necessary choices to make it as successful as possible. Now, I think that part of the blame a little bit lies on Nico Hülkenberg. He's especially qualifying up so well in the sprint. You got to kind of try and protect the car. I mean, he's in a position to just kind of cruise. Maybe he loses a couple of spots, but he cruises his way to a potential points pay position. But in the end, I'd say racing incident, nobody's really predominantly at fault. Everybody keeps talking about the cutback as if Oscar cut all the way to the apex and just shut the door and there was nowhere for Nico to go. Watch the replay. There is more than a car's width on the apex when he's completing the cutback. And it's just bad luck that Alonso also decided to go for the move at the same time. So that was kind of covers the sprint. And then in the Grand Prix, in Grand Prix qualifying, obviously, Oscar nowhere near really where he needed to be as far as qualifying pace, as his struggles are seeming to continue. And then in the Grand Prix, Oscar's just overall pace behind Lewis Hamilton was not very good. I thought for sure that once Lewis started to drop off the back of the fight with Oscar and Lando, Lando and Charles, that Oscar would be able to close up and kind of work his way ahead of Lewis, just considering how all season Lewis's long run pace has typically fallen off compared to Leclerc's on high rear usage tracks. That was not the case. He just kind of got left in the dust. It did get a little close at the end when Lewis appeared to have a problem on the final lap, and Oscar looked to have gotten within about a second or so of potentially getting past Lewis, but another weekend, another Lewis trying to survive to the checkered flag situation. Lando, on the other hand, not a great getaway at the start of the Grand Prix as well. Leclerc snuck his way in front. And I thought through that first stint we were going to see another one of those kind of unfortunate classic Lando Norris not learning. He constantly was setting up that outside move in T12. I understand he is trying to be careful with the car. Like at that stage, a DNF hurts him significantly more than a P3 finish and being stuck behind Leclerc. But what it did cause him was to go all the way to the first pit stop behind Leclerc and having to make that move in the second stop. And all that time, Verstappen was able to just grow his lead out front. Now, I think Lando in clear air had a clear pace advantage on Verstappen. I think he was absolutely the quicker car. But all that time lost behind Leclerc, it just kind of left the gap as too big to overcome. And I will give credit to not Leclerc, but Lando. In the second stint, he came out and I thought it looked like he was about to do the same thing again. Get stuck behind Leclerc, not able to make the move past, and then his tires started overheating and falling off. Big credit to his race engineer, Will Joseph, and Lando for being able to execute, dropping back by a couple of seconds, letting the tires cool down, and then going back on the re-attack with a good pace advantage. And especially really clever from him, which although it did not immediately pay dividends by being an overtake, the move he made into turn one up the inside of Leclerc, which Leclerc pretty easily covered with the cutback, as you often do into turn one in the middle of a race. While it may not have gotten the job done and gotten Lando ahead, what it did do was it put Leclerc kind of on the back foot and allowed Lando to be the closest he could through the S's section, through the first sector, so that by the time they finally got down to turn 11, got down to the DRS zone and into turn 12, he then committed to the far inside line. He had so often in the first stint and even at the early part of the second stint been looking to go around the outside and cut back in turn 12. When the final move was made, he got his car right up the inside of turn 12, made a very good move to make it stick on Leclerc. So credit to Lando. I know I've talked early in the season about him getting stuck trying to make the same thing work over and over, and it just doesn't often pay off. This time he was able to make that secondary move, the different change, and get the job done on Leclerc. Again, he was a little too far back from Verstappen for it to have him fight for the race win, but a very important P2 finish because it made it a 10-point swing between him and his teammate instead of what it would have been 7, 3 points difference. So yeah, big improvement for Lando to get there on race pace. Now, one thing I am looking forward for the rest of the season is we are hitting the kind of section of tracks last year where Ferrari made a late charge into McLaren's run for the Constructors' Championship. It was a bunch of tracks where McLaren had stopped development and started to fall back towards the field. Are we potentially going to see the same thing? I know with the Constructors' Championship wrapped up and the gap that they had going into the last couple of weeks, maybe they have been doing the same, and that might be allowing Red Bull to get more in the mix, as well as cars like Mercedes and even potentially a Ferrari to start to get in the mix where it's not just the Verstappen and McLaren show. There may be some outside actors that have their part to say in the drivers' championship as well this year, especially if you get, these kinds of P2 finishes from the likes of Leclerc and Russell. They could really get in and amongst it, and I don't know that McLaren is, going to be there. As far as the math goes, 1-2 finishes swings it either way for the McLarens, but we're hitting a point in the season where we cannot guarantee a 1-2, not necessarily even a 2-3 finish anymore. It's possible that we may even see some of the McLarens outside the top 5 as we run to the end of the season.
Gabriel is in the pits now.
Next up, we'll go to Ferrari, who Charles Leclerc had a fantastic Grand Prix, but the Ferraris looked decent all weekend. In the sprint, they had a P3, P4 finish. Granted, that was with, some missing McLarens, but that was led by Lewis Hamilton, who made an overtake on his teammate later in, showed some great late pace. I was concerned even after the sprint was finished if their pace was real, because we know they have the plank wear issue. We know that COTA is a bumpy track, and we've even seen it so many times this season. Either the sprint, they look good and then they just totally fall off in the races, or even early in the race, they look competitive and then they're just nowhere in the second half of the race. So it did appear that they've managed to maintain that pace against a track that I would think would not necessarily suit them. That P3, P4 finish in the sprint turned into a 4-5 in the sprint, 3-4 in the Grand Prix, backwards. So they actually even went forward when the McLarens were in there. Apologies, I got my notes backwards. But I started thinking critically. But, it's looking like Ferrari is maybe it's a fluke, but maybe it's also an opportunity that they've discovered something. We are headed to some more smooth tracks on the calendar, which will help them out. But Leclerc managed P2 for a significant part of the race. Lewis, I was kind of hoping early on that he would be more of a factor in the Norris-Leclerc battle. He got close. He got nearly to within DRS range on a couple of occasions while they fought, but it just seems that he didn't quite have the pace to hang with them, and I think that was evidenced in the second stint of the race, where he was a decent way behind them come the end of the race. And then at the end, there was that, like I mentioned, significant loss of time from Lewis, where Oscar almost caught up to him. From what I've seen, there's not been real official word on it, but from the team radio, it sounds like Lewis was expecting a slow puncture or an issue with the front suspension, because he said basically all of his front grip just went, especially on the front right. So it was a decent pace weekend for Ferrari, but again, we've got this kind of looming specter of reliability problems once again. Obviously, Singapore had the brakes just totally going away from both Leclerc and Hamilton. And this week, it seems like something else has happened with either a puncture, or if it's a puncture, there's not much they can do about it because that's just the tire letting go. If it's a suspension issue, then I think they got something to be worried about. So we'll see if they are able to get to the end of the season without any more reliability issues, or, you know, reliability is one of those things that carries on year to year because it's more procedural in parts than, you know, regulations. So if they're all of a sudden really struggling with such things, it's not exactly a reach to think they may end up with an issue in the 2026 regulations of the reliability as well. Next up, we've got Mercedes, and they started off decently, but then seemed to slowly fall back over the course of the weekend. Both drivers scored points in the sprint, with George taking advantage of that early chaos and finishing a nice little P2 there. But in the Grand Prix, neither car really had great pace. Antonelli got caught up in an early incident. Actually, I'll have to look at my notes so I don't mix things up again, but let me go through these corners. But yeah, the Grand Prix, only a single P6 result for George. And it looked like he might be able to challenge a little further up based on what we saw in the sprint, and also what he had said early on when he was kind of closing up to the struggling Oscar Piastri. He even said Oscar's looked slow. But after that, he kind of fell off the back of that pack and didn't really go anywhere. But P6 is still decent. That car, on and off, it tends to be. Antonelli had a scrappy day, having to recover from an early incident, and managed to get himself back to P12. But for after a couple of weeks where it looks like he was kind of figuring it out, Antonelli, you know, another struggle weekend is not going to help him. I believe, though, he should have some pressure off of his shoulders now that they've been confirmed, which if I didn't mention it last week, I know I recorded and then re-recorded, and I don't remember some of the stuff I might have missed. If I didn't mention it last week, it has been confirmed that Kimi and George are going to be in the car for the 2026 season. So hopefully that lack of pressure will allow Antonelli to just kind of step up what he's doing and not worry about an incoming contract for the year. The Mercs, it's a decent car, but they are continuing to have this kind of on again, off again performance. And much like I was talking about in the McLaren section, they are the kind of car that could play spoiler, as George has already done in Singapore, could play spoiler to this the championship math. If George essentially takes another race win away from Max Verstappen, it could be the end of that challenge, or he could be scoring points ahead of the McLarens and taking points off of them. So, we'll have to see. Next up, the car we are currently in, the driver we are currently being Sauber and Nico Hülkenberg. Started the weekend very strong, actually had a pretty decent weekend throughout it. A Q3 appearance in sprint qualifying put him right up at the sharp end. Obviously was involved in that incident with Piastri right at the start. I've said my portions on it. I don't think Hülkenberg was wrong to go for the move. I just think if I'm sitting in his seat at that point, I'm defending hard from Alonso, not giving him the door. I'm not going to get in amongst the Ferraris and Mercedes and them. And he could probably hold on to a pretty solid point or two in the sprint if he does that. But you also don't get to Formula One by being super conservative. So He did well to get up there. He did have a decent Grand Prix qualifying, only just missing Q3 from the GP qualifying. And was another weekend ahead of Gabriel Bortoleto, who seems to have started struggling recently, as he has been kind of my odds-on pick for Rookie of the Year. Bortoleto, though, has struggled in the last couple of weekends. But Nico did manage to bring the car home in the points on Sunday. He was on a really poor run of form, especially in qualifying for a while here, but he looks to be getting that kind of form back and returning to the things that made him, one of the best journeymen in F1 and has given him such a long career. Let's get out of the pit lane here on these hard tires, and then we'll talk about the next team, which is Haas. And unlike the dynamic at Sauber, which seems to be flicking back towards its more established teammate, Esteban Ocon continues to struggle in comparison with Oliver Bearman. He was out-qualified by Ali, I believe, in both qualifying sessions, the sprint and the Grand Prix. And Esteban had his sprint come to an end in what would bring out the final safety car in a tussle with Lance Stroll. And Oliver Bearman became the last car running in that sprint because he got himself into a bit of trouble on a few occasions this weekend. The first of which earned him a 10-second penalty, which was whilst trying to defend and hang out around the outside of this upcoming corner here, turn 12. He went wide off the track and maintained his position in a battle with Antonelli, and he was given a 10-second time penalty. And with the sprint finishing under the safety car, basically meant, he was going to be last car running no matter what because of that extra time penalty. It was another situation of my least favorite rule coming into play, where if you have the inside line and you're even slightly ahead, you don't have to give any space to the car on the outside. In my opinion, and I know this is not how the rules are written and how they will be adjudicated, but my complaint always is the way the rules are written kill side-by-side racing. Because Bearman was still significantly alongside Antonelli at the apex of the corner. He just wasn't ahead. If the rules were that you had to leave space for cars significantly alongside, we would have seen that battle continue to the really cool triple right-hander, maybe even to the last couple of corners of the track. But because Antonelli is allowed by the rules to just usher Bearman right off the circuit, that's the end of that. He gets not only does he lose the position, he gets a penalty on top of it. So, again, my least favorite way that they have the current racing guidelines, and I will always complain about that. Now, Bearman was involved in another incident in the same area, which was his fault, I would say, and it was with Yuki Tsunoda, and it was in the first apex of that double left-hander there. He was fighting with Yuki Tsunoda and trying to get up the inside and make that kind of inside lunge that we saw so much over the weekend. It turned out to be a very good overtaking spot, the inside of turn 15. Now, he had to jump across the apex onto the grass, lost control of the car and spun because of it and dropped back, a considerable amount of time. My opinion of it, watching it back, is this. He complains that Yuki moved under braking. I think that Yuki probably was semi-reactive in that move. However, there was never a car's width on the inside. Yuki never opened up that door. So I think even without that little jink to the left that well and truly shut the door, there was never ever going to be a spot for Behrman to go through. He was always going to be run out of space there. So luckily for him, at that point in the race, the gaps were well established, and he still managed to come home in the points, scoring a solid finish for the team, while Ocon was also, nowhere to be found. As far as the Haas team goes, Esteban Ocon is kind of running out of races to reestablish himself as the team leader, because the way it's going, Ollie Behrman is out-qualifying him on a weekly basis. He is now out-racing him on a weekly basis. Esteban Ocon's stock is very, very quickly plummeting in my book. And you got a rookie that's kind of showing him up. Okay, next up, Aston Martin. So, we've talked a little bit about it. Fernando Alonso was part of that lap 1, turn 1 melee in the sprint. I think very ambitious from him to go up the inside when you know that everything is going to collapse to the inside there. And as much as Fernando Alonso loves to bemoan his bad luck, I think that was a case of him creating his own bad luck personally, because there was just not really anywhere for him to go up the inside there, especially considering you're in the middle of the pack and you know that the front of the pack is not going to get through that corner very quickly and is going to create this big old accordion effect. And then, as we talked about with Haas, it was Lance Stroll's ambitious dive into turn 1. He made a couple of moves stick in turn 1 in the sprint, but when he tried to go for the move on Esteban Ocon, he locked up, hit them, and that created a nice little, well, not a nice, but a double DNF in the sprint for the Aston Martin team that looked halfway decent on overall pace. The Grand Prix went a little more according to plan, as Fernando Alonso had a Q3 appearance and was able to convert that into points, the final points paying position. And Lance, who started quite far back, recovered 7 positions on the day, including the longest soft tire stint of anybody to start the race, even longer than Leclerc's, and nearly brought himself into the battle with Fernando Alonso and Liam Lawson for the last couple points paying positions. There has been some recent signs of promise out of the Aston Martin team, and they are now only 3 points behind the Racing Bulls in the Constructors' Championship. So they very much have the potential to grab that P6 finish in the Constructors. And speaking of the Racing Bulls team, they are the next on the list. And this was one of those weekends where Liam Lawson had the measure of Isaac Hadjar all weekend. However, it ultimately did not result in any points being scored, as he was just outside the points in both the race, the sprint, and the Grand Prix. Hello, Gabriel. He finished P9 in the sprint, so 1 place away from scoring a point in the sprint. And then, of course, P11 in the Grand Prix. So, again, 1 position off. Isaac had a crash in Q1 for the Grand Prix, causing him to start all the way at the back. VCarb took a gamble on the hard tire at the start of the race. And as VCarb gambles so often go, the hard tire did not prove to be a very good race tire. Very few teams tried it and went on to it, and most avoided it for good reason. The two-step gap to the hard tire meant it was pretty slow, especially considering that you could still one-stop the mediums and softs without too much major concern. And so he only finished ahead of the 2 Alpines and 1 Gabriel Bortoleto. So the recent trend in the Racing Bulls has seen Isaac with the edge over Liam Lawson. So they seem to be kind of nip and tuck. And these two being so close to each other, it does look like the end of this season is likely going to turn into essentially an audition for the second Red Bull seat in 2026, which remains open at the moment. And I think one of them will be promoted to the Red Bull team for next year. Next up, we've got the team that is P5 in the Constructors, Williams. Now, they started off the weekend very strong with Carlos scoring a P3 finish in the sprint, and Alex was just on the other side of the two Ferraris in P6. So a double sprint points finish looked very good for the outfit. But on Sunday, and well, the latter part of Saturday even, qualifying did not go very well as Alex had a Q1 exit. Carlos made it back into Q3, which was a good performance from him there. But on Sunday, it all kind of unraveled. Alex, starting at the back, was caught in a lap 1 tussle that saw him facing the wrong way early on and having to recover. And then Carlos Sainz, though he showed such good moves up the inside of turn 15, one of them eventually went astray and resulted in his retirement. So there was at least a decent haul of points on Saturday to make up for the lack of points on Sunday. And for Williams, realistically, at this stage of the season, with the margin that they have to the teams behind in the Constructors, they are pretty much locked in to P5 in the Constructors and are able to start looking to 2026 at this point in the year. And then you've got Alpine. You know, Alpine started the weekend with a little bit of hope as Gasly did come P10 in the sprint. It's no points, obviously. Only the top 8 scoring in a sprint, but it at least showed that, you know, he could be there or thereabouts on overall pace potentially in the Grand Prix on Sunday. That, however, definitely did not come to fruition as they started the Grand Prix near the back of the field and spent the rest of the race at the back of the field and would have had one of their nice, typical, quiet, disappointing weekends if not for their need to embarrass themselves on team radio by enacting team orders to try and hold Franco Colapinto behind Pierre Gasly for P17 and P18. Now, they said that both cars were managing and saving, so I'm assuming they're such an embarrassment that they were saving fuel because they expected to be lapped in order to, and they underfueled the cars expecting to be lapped, which is, that's just, come on, guys. Like, if that's the case, come on. Otherwise, if it's not that, why are you holding Franco Colapinto, who was a good half a second a lap faster than Gasly, behind the slower car, while also under attack from the Sauber of Gabriel Bortoleto? I guess one thing, if you guys are running dead last and next to last, I don't care what you do. But if you're trying to play politics to keep your lead driver ahead in the head-to-head, come on. Especially on a weekend where Alpine was running a special livery that highlighted a sponsor that Franco Colapinto brought in. You're going to make it that silly. So I don't fault Colapinto at all at this stage for making the choice to ignore that team order and overtake. Because not only did he clear that gap, Bortoleto got by Gasly. So were they really trying to secure the last two places? At least Colapinto showed some fight in him at the end. And it's unfortunately the kind of things that you just almost come to expect from Alpine at this stage. I mean, even when they were fighting for points, Alpine always made, or Renault when they were in the day, they made silly, silly political decisions. And so they've only got half of the points of the team ahead of them in the Constructors. There's no upgrades on the way. I'd say at this point, P10 is absolutely inevitable for the Alpine team. So that runs the quick review of what we had. Well, I won't say quick because there was a lot to talk about. But that's COTA. Now let's jump over to the next circuit and we'll walk our way around Mexico. So here we are on the starting grid of Mexico, and you can see based on the track map on the right and just what you see ahead of us, it is one huge long run down to turn one. And the front row is almost a disadvantage around this circuit because the slipstream is so powerful. So with such important things of the championship on the line, it could get very spicy going down to turn one, and it's also very wide, as I will show when we get down there. So let's head down to turn one at full pelt, so you can see just how long it takes for us to get there and how wide the track is. You'll see it spreads way out. You will see 4, 5 cars wide on the way down to the opening complex, which is a right, left, right, 3-corner combination. So it's going to be real interesting. There's often carbon fiber found here on lap 1 as you work through that opening complex. So then we'll head down towards turn 4, which is another little DRS blast. Not quite as good of an opportunity for a run, but you then get this very slow, almost awkward combination of corners. Relatively tight left-hander turns into a very tight right-hander. And then you've got this very short little run to this slow double right-hander. So a little complex of corners. If drivers are willing to go side-by-side through there, it makes for some really good side-by-side action. However, the way the rules are, as I've bemoaned so many times, you'll probably just see people pushing each other off into the grass and calling it good. Which I'll talk a little bit about because that's probably going to be one of the bigger moments, is pushing people off. But then you head into the sweepers, which is a really technical portion of the circuit. Really, the way the corners are set up in the game is not quite perfect. The angle of these last 2 corners is, you can go flat out. This right-hander is quite a bit sharper, I believe, in real life, and the left-hander a little more sweeping. But you do get to work through that section. It's basically single file. Not a lot of opportunity to go side by side through there, but you do get a little blast of DRS. This one, because of the dirty air of the sweepers, not so much an overtaking opportunity of DRS, but more to help close the cars up as you come into this really kind of awkward stadium section. So you slow down, hang a right, and now you get to kind of trip over, everyone to trip over each other because of how slow the stadium section can be. You have this very tight left-handed hairpin that quickly opens into this right-hander. A short run, and the way you can see how the track moves back and forth on itself, there's really not any space to go side by side. And then you're out of the final corner, which is a really, really critical section because not only is it a huge DRS zone, the detection point is right before the final corner, and that detection point is good for both the straight heading down to turn 1 as well as the very next DRS zone where you have the straight heading down between turns 3 and 4. This is the same DRS detection as the main straight. So you don't get a lot of pass and repass on that opportunity. It's more, you will typically see cars get the move done into the turn 1, 2, 3 complex and then try and grow the gap with that second bit. So now we'll push the pace a little bit more in the sweepers. A little bit of a braking zone there, not much the site of quite the flashpoint of action. Which, before I talk strategy, I'll talk about, well, one of the bigger controversies last year, which was the Verstappen-Norris battle, which saw Max earn quite the hefty penalty. And, you know, we're seeing a different Max. Obviously, though, we haven't really seen side-by-side, wheel-to-wheel Max quite yet too hard when he's needed it and has been at a significant disadvantage, as happened last year. He's been in the car that's on the up and coming, on the catch-up this year, and I think that's been benefiting his mental state. Who knows? I could be wrong. He could also just have made mental improvements and adjustments based on, you know, not wanting to do what he did last year. I'll give him credit if that's the case, but we'll have to see, especially as he gets down in the nitty-gritty, and he can absolutely taste this championship coming. It's right there for him to take away from the two McLarens. And we'll continue with kind of the notes, because I'm already there, as I said. Max Verstappen within reaching distance of the championship now. The gap between him and the championship lead, Oscar, is only 40 points now. So he does need to average just over 8 points a weekend, which does include another 2 sprints, both in Qatar and Brazil. So there's 8 points on offer right there. So he needs to make up that margin in order to catch Oscar for the World Championship. Lando Norris is just 14 points behind Oscar Piastri. So he needs to catch by just under 3 points per race in order to get there. So obviously it's a little more on for Norris at this stage, but I'm not counting out Max. I think Max has it well within his talents to get the job done in this championship, especially with the way that McLarens are both driving and continuing to shoot themselves in the foot, because at least from one of the recent articles that I've read is that McLaren has re-reviewed the Singapore incident, as well as taken the Texas sprint into account, and has removed the qualifying repercussions that allowed Oscar to pick when he wanted to go out for his qualifying run. So it would appear that those repercussions lasted exactly 1 week. And we know that they alternate priority week to week. So I don't know that there was even a repercussion felt. I'd have to go back and look and see what the qualifying order was the last couple races, see if I can suss out who had the advantage the last couple of weekends. But it's possible, since they only enacted it on 1 week, they could have enacted it on a week where Oscar was already going to have priority and removed it. And like I said in the Mexico review, I don't think that was Oscar's fault. I think it was ambitious to go for the cutback, but I do think he left the space that would be necessary to account for another car going up the inside of the cutback, which is usually the folly. But so that's kind of the storylines going into it. Obviously, you have Lewis wanting to get himself on the podium. You certainly have George and the Ferraris wanting to play spoiler to the championship parade and just make it complicated for anyone and mess with the math. So we'll see how they perform. But we'll close with what we normally start with after the little track run, and that is tire strategy. So much like Texas, this year Pirelli has gapped between the medium and hard tires. So in the previous 2 years where they've gone C5, C4, C3, they are now going C5 for the soft, C4 for the medium, and C2 for the hard. Now, considering what we saw in Texas, where teams just ignored the hard for the most part and managed and dealt with the soft and medium to a one-stop, I have a strong suspicion that that's what we may see here as well. Because last season, we did see the C3, C4 one-stop be the primary strategy, almost exclusive strategy. So medium to hard or hard to medium. The year before, we did see a couple of mixtures of 1 and 2 stops between the mediums and the hards. Although we saw a lot of run the medium, run a very short stint, get off the hards, and get a second set of mediums on. So that was an interesting strategic wrinkle. But I do think strategically we're probably looking at another one-stop with management, so drivers not pushing super hard. This is a really interesting circuit. You've got this big, long DRS zone, which can definitely help with overtaking. But one thing to keep in mind is that at Mexico City, there is significant altitude. And though the cars will have some of their highest downforce packages on, they'll basically have nearly Monaco level wings bolted onto the car. The amount of actual functional downforce that they are getting is similar to a low downforce track. And when you have low downforce or low air pressure, that means the DRS effect is reduced because there's less drag to reduce. And the slipstream effect is also reduced. So for a track that has a big long straight that you would think would make for some very easy overtakes, Mexico City often has not been super great for that, especially considering you have to work your way through a very slow and awkward final sector before you get out onto the main straight, and that tends to space the cars out quite a bit. Gonna think. I don't know that I have anything else necessarily to say. I think I've covered it all. This has probably been a longer episode. But back-to-back weekends. We're getting to the last couple of weekends of the season. There's only 5 race weekends left, 2 sprints. And that's all there is to the 2025 season. So thank you all, as always, for joining me. Leave any questions or anything in the comments. As always, I will respond if I see them or talk about them in the next episode. But you all have a great one. See you next time. Peace.